All right, so we're going to go ahead and get started, and if any stragglers arrive, hopefully they'll know to just come on in. So good evening, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm Anna Nettleship. I'm the Managing Director of the King's Wargaming Network, and I'm pleased to introduce you to the network's second annual Keynote Lecture. Our Keynote Lecture series is held on the anniversary of the network's founding and features current and former Wargaming Network staff discussing their research in wargaming. The network builds on a rich history of wargaming activity and education here at King's to serve as a hub for the ever-increasing number of King's students, staff, and faculty researching and applying wargaming in their work. The network was founded in 2018 as an expression of intellectual humility in a new strategic era where complex modern problems such as deterrence, escalation, and unconventional combat have required new tools to analyze and counter. Our core mission is to advance wargaming as a method of inquiry and as a method for learning and teaching. Since our founding, we've developed and built upon an agenda of activities to support that core mission. We've convened an annual public lecture series featuring speakers presenting on important new contributions to assessment and adaptation in wargaming, wargaming contemporary security problems, wargaming non-warfare and cross-disciplinary subjects, and the theory and applications of wargaming. Our 2023-2024 public lecture series features speakers who have made important new contributions to naval wargaming, either as civilian or uniformed researchers and practitioners. Network staff have developed new research and analytic methodologies, including the Competitive Strategies Analytic Group Experiment, developed by Dr. Ivanka Barzashka and Jonathan Rich, a methodology that has gone on to be adapted for multiple applications in wargaming research and academic analysis. In 2018, we launched our Wargame Analyst Program, a specialist training program we run every year that offers tailored instruction in data gathering and wargame facilitation. Alumni of this program have gone on to work for leading wargaming providers and consumers, as well as to design and adapt wargaming methodologies into their own research. We were joined in 2020 by Dr. David Banks. Our academic directors continued the history of wargaming education here at King's with the development of 2 MA modules, Wargaming Principles and Practice and Designing Wargaming for Education and Analysis. At the conclusion of our 2021-2022 agenda of activities, we founded the MA Wargaming Exposition Series, where graduates of these courses have the opportunity to showcase the completed wargames they've created to practitioners and academics. The network is also supporting multiple PhD candidates here at King's who are focusing their dissertation on aspects of wargaming or significantly incorporating wargaming into their research. In 2019, we launched the network's Wargaming Week, a series of events held at the end of the academic year that includes research wargames by King's staff and students, hosted wargames with external partners or organizations, such as RAND and Lawrence Livermore National Labs, academic and professional wargaming workshops, and panel events and expositions of current wargaming research taking place here at King's. In 2020, this was adapted into a remote international multi-day workshop featuring current wargaming inquiry into pandemic responses. And in 2023, we resumed the Wargaming Week on campus in partnership with NATO ACT. This year, we're proud to announce we will be continuing our partnership with NATO ACT to host our Wargaming Week from the 16th to the 19th of April, 2024, which will feature internally designed wargames, panels, and expositions of wargaming research and design workshops here at King's. This evening, I'm proud to introduce our academic director, Dr. David Banks, to give our second annual keynote lecture, Do Not Pass Go, Why Establishing the Foundations of Wargaming Matters. Dr. Banks is a wargaming lecturer at the War Studies Department at King's. He's designed a number of wargames for research and education and teaches 2 MA modules on wargaming methods and wargame design. His current wargaming research is focused on determining epistemological standards for evaluating wargames as a research method. This includes projects on the foundation of wargaming, how to link theory to design, and the role of subject matter experts in professional wargames. In addition to his wargaming research, Dr. Banks also studies diplomatic practice and international society, with a special emphasis on symbolic and rhetorical diplomacy. His current book manuscript researches the motivation for and political consequences of state violations of diplomatic practice. As we have pursued our core mission at the network to advance wargaming as a method of inquiry and as a method for learning and teaching, Dr. Banks has sought to fill existing gaps in the epistemological foundations of wargaming as a methodology and to investigate if and how it produces knowledge. Tonight, Dr. Banks will identify 5 prominent distinguishing features of wargaming as a method and consider how better understanding them can provide some epistemological foundations for the method of wargaming. So without further ado, let me welcome you all once again and hand over to Dr. Banks for our second annual keynote address. Thank you very much.
Hello, everybody. Good evening. Thank you for coming out on a not very nice Thursday evening. I appreciate your interest or your inability to catch a train home and decide to just stay in here. Today, as Anna said, I am giving a presentation based on research I have concluded, early stages of research that I hope will act as the template or foundation of a book that I intend to start working on next year. But this particular lecture is derived predominantly from a research article I have coming out with International Studies Review next March, which will be up on one of the slides as we go along. And it's about, as the name suggests, the importance of establishing the foundations, the epistemological foundations of wargaming, by which I mean, when I say epistemological, by which I mean the knowledge-producing foundations of wargaming. If and how we know wargames are producing knowledge, and how we can tell that that knowledge is useful and able to be comparatively evaluated. I have a quote here from Ludwig Wittgenstein, which sort of gets to two things that I think are interesting here. One is this famous quote from Ludwig Wittgenstein about philosophical commitments or beliefs that we have when we think about things. The first step is the one that altogether escapes notice. We often make moves intellectually in which we don't really think about our prior beliefs in any meaningful way. We accept those as given or uncomplicated or uncontroversial, and we just move from that position without questioning those initial positions. And I would claim that sometimes that's what we see in wargaming. If we don't see it consciously as a decision not to care, we see it as a sort of essential belief that it's too hard to understand what these foundations are. It's a fool's errand, and that there's no real value in doing so. The other reason I use Wittgenstein's quote is because many of you might know that Wittgenstein was famous for saying that games are something that cannot be defined. It's one of the very famous positions he held because of his theory of language games. And he said that games can't be defined. And what do you know? People later on were able to challenge that and define them. And so, in fact, even Wittgenstein himself just went ahead and made a claim and said, well, this is obvious, this can't be defined. And then later on, people beat him to it. And I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that we should be careful about judgments that we make and claims about whether or not something can or cannot be done. We should at least, I would say, consider how we might try to solve some of these questions. So what I'm going to do over the course of about 45 or 50 minutes, I don't want to belabor things, is talk a little bit about, based on the literature and current practice, how we understand wargaming working and some of the problems and consequences of those particular practices and beliefs. The foundations of wargaming as it's currently understood in the academic literature and on the practitioner literature on this, and broadly speaking, we can identify two broad camps. And then an argument towards a way of maybe, a way of maybe identifying the epistemological foundations of wargaming by recognizing and highlighting its methodological machinery, a term I promise I will define, and using that as the starting off point to try to determine better if and how wargames might produce knowledge. So this is really a lecture about a research program and a call to research arms rather than a set of conclusions, because I'll just say this now before I forget, all of our work is ahead of us. This is a very exciting intellectual place to be. I find work on wargaming methodology to be really interesting, to my great surprise. I never thought I'd be a methodologist, because so many of these questions are unanswered. And so this is really, more than anything, is setting some of the questions and trying to encourage more work in those areas. So let's start by talking a little bit about how wargaming works. How do we understand when wargaming works? Well, there's a current set of ways we can identify how wargames are evaluated. Some of these are done implicitly or informally. Some are said explicitly, and in some cases I can give you citations if you're looking for them about who makes these kinds of claims as ways of evaluating games. One is participant satisfaction. Let's ask the people themselves whether they thought they learned something in terms of an educational way or whether they discovered something analytically. Now, this here is a picture of participants in the King's NATO game that we designed for NATO at their most recent Wargaming week in 2023, just gone past, called At the Threshold. This was a multi-domain operational game about conflict between NATO and Russia in the sub-threshold domain over Finland. There was a number of games all running simultaneously together. Some people really enjoyed these games. Some people couldn't stand it and wished it would end. The point is, I'm not really sure these are the right people to ask this question to. Wargaming literacy is not especially high amongst most people. It itself, as a method, is a little bit confusing. And so we have to be very careful about asking participants. Furthermore, in my experience of using games in the classroom primarily, overwhelmingly, when people come into a game experience, they're negative. The majority view, the median participant in a war game before it begins is hostile to the idea. The median participant in a war game after the experience is extremely enthusiastic. And then the problem then is they often leave saying things like, oh, now I've just learned how this would happen, how that would happen. And you'd stand there and go, no, you couldn't have learned that from this game. That's not what this game was actually teaching you, yet you've gone off. And so you can kind of get as a very positive version of negative learning. where they leave learning the wrong lesson. So I wouldn't recommend looking at participants. Now, one of the ones that's often used is let's wait for the history to catch up, right? War games are often used about imaginary or putative real-world events, things that may happen in the future, that could happen in the present. Well, let's see when the real thing happens. Is that going to be the reason it happened? That will be verification for a game. Now, there's at least two problems with this. One is it may never happen, right? So if it never happens, what are you going to do with your game now? Is it automatically a bad game because history didn't happen? I mean, that's not the game's fault. And it's not a very effective way of this kind of wait and see practice. But furthermore, if you're not quite clear yourself about how your game worked, how plausible the results of your own game were, how clear and specified your model of the game is and your own intellectual commitments inside that game, it might be hard for you to evaluate whether or not just because it happens in the real world, it's actually happening for the reasons it happened in your game. Because things happen in the real world that shouldn't have happened in the real world. My favorite example of this, my students will be familiar with this example, is the sinking of the HMS Hood by the Bismarck in the Battle of the Denmark Straits in 1941. As many of you know, the Bismarck engaged one battleship, one battle cruiser of the Royal Navy, which makes it look like the Royal Navy is going to win this fight. And within 5 minutes of engaging the Hood, they sank it, with essentially what amounts to a lucky shot. Now, that's what really happened. But that's not what should have happened. And what should have happened is they should have been able to trade blows for at least a few hours and probably limped away from one another. So here, even real-world verification wouldn't be very useful. Because you could imagine a scenario in which you would have designed a war game in which it would be very difficult for the Hood to be sunk immediately, and then the Hood was sunk immediately. You could imagine somebody would come back and say, your war game's junk, the Hood was sunk immediately, what a terrible game. Actually, this is a lucky fluke. And so we have, well, not lucky, but it's an unexpected fluke. And so we have to kind of recognize this verification in this way is not effective. A very common informal practice here is designer validation. This is the process by which designers develop reputations for being excellent wargame practitioners and or theorists. And I'm not saying these reputations are not deserved. That's not my claim at all. But then, of course, that becomes a currency of its own. And so then you have certain people who become associated with particular games or game systems or associated with effective games in the past. And so their reputation carries them forward. Other designers recommend them, others commend them. It's not an effective way of getting a sense of who's who in the world and who might be doing good work. But again, it's not a robust or systematic way of getting some sort of effective evaluation of a game. And then I think as my thing just died, that's a bit of bad luck. As the entire computer just died would be a different question. Oh, that's not good. Here we go. Let's try this. There we go. And then lastly, which we'll often see in both academic wargaming and in professional wargaming texts, is an admonition to remember the game's purpose. Now, this is something I do all the time in my class, especially my design class, obviously. When I tell my students, this is a slide from my class. When I tell my students not to get too kind of seduced by their own game mechanics, to always try to remember their North Star, right? What is the North Star? Where are you actually, what is guiding you? It's the purpose of your game. Don't get distracted by, in this case, a cool design feature. Remember what you're doing. Now, I think that's a very effective and useful heuristic in admonition. It's not a program. Right? Knowing where north is not the same way of knowing how to get to somewhere. And so it's good. I would contend it's not nearly enough to just sort of intuitively say, okay, I know this is off my purpose somewhat. How much is it off your purpose? Off a lot? Off a little? Why? How bad is it that it's off its purpose? I think we need to have a more developed language to be able to make these kinds of evaluations. So what does this mean? Well, it means that we have a confidence problem in wargaming. As it stands, there is no coherent or systematic way to compare or evaluate games on their own terms. That would be my claim. That is to say, game qua game, especially if we're looking at games that, for example, are not studying the same subject. So how do I know that this game about coin operations in Syria is better than this game about strategic decision-making in a climate crisis in 2045? Right? We don't have a way of comparing these two things in a way effectively where you could say that was the better one. Although it's different theme, different mechanics, this is a better game than that one. You should want to do more like this and less like that. Now, I think a major part of this, a considerable part of this, is a reporting problem. There's no standardized way of reporting war games. And I've read many, many long war game reports in excess of 100 pages where you get to the end of it and you've got a sense of what the game was about, and you've got a sense of what happened in the games, but you actually don't have a clear sense of a report. I don't know specifically how the game worked. I don't know specifically the kind of results were generated. I don't know specifically the kinds of interpretations that are being made that are separate from the results. There's also, of course, a very considerable reporting problem that many games take place in secret. There's nothing we can do about that. But I'm also not aware of some systematic language that's happening behind the line of secrecy that's not happening in the public square. I think this problem is replicating. Now, I think one of the reasons this problem exists at all is precisely because we don't have sufficient epistemological foundations. If you're not sure what you're looking for, and if you're not sure what's right or wrong, you're going to kitchen sink the data. You're going to throw in the things that you think makes the most sense. You're going to throw in the things that you think is obviously true or not according to some sort of systematic protocol of you should be reporting this, you should make sure you give these kinds of things. It's just going to be like, well, that kind of seems to be what happened in the games. And so what I often get from reading these reports is a sense of what occurred, but no confidence. I have no confidence. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying I don't have confidence. I don't know really what happened. And absent of being in the room and observed the games myself, I've got no way of being able to use these as analytic products. And basically, I wouldn't. I'd be like, well, I don't know. So, I mean, I can't give a recommendation one way or another because I can't read this output. And it's not that I can't read it because I'm not literate. It's because it's not clear. It's not a clear output. And so I think this is a significant problem. Now, how much of a problem it is, your mileage may vary. In one of the reviewers of this article, which went through a couple of rounds of review before it was finally accepted in the journal, the parting shot of one of my reviewers was, the key problem for your suggested investigation of professional wargaming is no one is interested. Wargames have value and work. Who wants to spend time and money on theory when the world is apparently lurching from crisis to crisis, right? I understand the sentiment. I understand the point. We don't have time for this kind of highfalutin ivory tower, pointy-headed intellectualism. There's a world out there that needs responses to its crises. Let's get busy with the process of doing that. I accept that that is a legitimate irritation that we have, but I want to make some reasons here for why this does matter. And I hope that at least one of these would be sufficient for people to take this question seriously. There are intellectual reasons. Whether you think it matters or not, and there's very good reasons that you might think it doesn't matter, it doesn't fly in the halls of academia. We have to be able to explain exactly how we generate, or at least clearly well enough, according to established standards, how we did the research that we did, sufficiently well that reviewers can understand it and reach conclusions of their own as to its merits. This here is just a slide, a picture of the submission guidelines for the journal I recently published in, or this is going to be published in. There's a lot of specificity. There's a lot of, you must do this. Now, some of it's just technical, you cannot exceed these words, but there's a set of expectations about what you need to do. And if you don't meet those expectations, the journals are likely to reject your work. And so wargaming is never going to get into the academic space and taken seriously as a method at the same level of statistics, ethnography, surveys, interviews, case studies, you name it. Those have clear processes and people can evaluate them and they can say, I've never read anything about it before, but I understand how archive research works and this is really good archive research. And that's sufficient for reviewers to be able to do it. So it's always going to be kept out of the halls of academia. Now you might go, well, who cares? Well, at a very cynical level, academia exercises an important laundering function for any intellectual product, right? At a minimum, if academics can stand behind it and say, this is good research, that's valuable for people in the real world. They can say, hey, don't ask me, ask the boffins. They said it's good enough. But that's one reason. I think another reason here, though, is that what we have here is there's also practical reasons, and that we can't, if we don't understand the assumptions that we're making, if we don't understand it, then we're never really going to be able to resolve these problems. We currently have a system of informal best practices. Some of them are in the public domain. Some I've learned from interviewing wargaming professionals. This is what we do. These kinds of things we do. I've got forthcoming research about how SMEs are used on this, for example. But the point is that without a clear sense of these underlying functions, you're always going to be locked out of being taken fully seriously. This here is the assumptions of ordinary least squares regression. Some of you may be having an allergic reaction as you see this, having to live through in sweaty memories of your statistics classes. Others might be baffled and say, I don't want to learn. And nor should you want to. My point here is, you may not understand statistics when you're doing them. You may even become very proficient at statistics and able to conduct statistical techniques very effectively all the time in your work and still not understand the assumptions you're making about the work. That's fine. It's not necessary for everyone to understand this. However, if you scratch hard enough, you will find the answer to why you should or should not believe the assumptions or what's going on inside that model. And you might then find out that these are the assumptions that are being made and say, these are ridiculous assumptions. I can't agree with any of these assumptions. I don't believe statistics. More often, what's actually gone on in statistics is there's a lot of robustness checks that after you run a statistical model, there's robustness checks, which essentially test these assumptions. Okay, we ran the model, and then let me run some sort of robustness check to see that the average value of the residuals is 0, right? And see that that's adequately accounted for, that we don't have some sort of problem with heteroscedasticity, and we can actually see if this is working. We can test our assumptions and see if the model is valid, and therefore the consumer can say, this meets its assumptions, and therefore it's good. We can accept it. Now, the point here, of course, is you might not accept these assumptions and say, I don't accept any of this. That's fine. You're perfectly entitled to do that, but at least you know what they are. You're not just dismissing it out of hand. And I'll give you a personal anecdote without having too many personal anecdotes. I'm a methods minor. I did my PhD in the United States, and my minor was in methods. And one of the things I took classes in was game theory, which is not like wargaming, and I'm happy to talk about why in the Q&A. But I remember my critiques of game theory prior to taking game theory were deeply shallow. They weren't very good critiques of game theory. They're in fact very typical critiques of game theory that I was not just making, a lot of my cohort were making, that, oh, you know, rationality, people aren't rational, it's useless, it's a waste of time. And then when I actually learned some game theory, you're like, oh, actually, those are kind of silly critiques. Like there's actually, it doesn't matter that these things aren't true, that's not how this model works. But the other thing, I could see the limits of the method better. I could actually understand what I did really well, and I could also understand what I didn't do really well. And then be able to say with much more confidence, oh, now I know I'm not using game theory. It's not just because I struggle with it. It's also because I don't need it, because it can't answer the kinds of questions I want to ask. And I understand that now because I'm literate, not fluent, literate in the method, and that's sufficient. But it's not because I'm having to kind of work it out myself. Somebody can answer these questions. And I think it's useful to have this somebody. But a final reason, I think perhaps the most important reason, is there's very strong ethical reasons. It's not, if we don't understand what's being produced with these games, and we can't say with confidence, hey, you should trust these outputs beyond it feels right, or I had some other people look at it, or hey, I think that fits the things reasonably well. You could be giving people bad information, and they could be learning the wrong lessons from a game that's teaching them the wrong lessons because it's designed that way. And that is a real ethical problem. We know, and I think Wargamers are right in saying very often, hey, you know, people, we do the games and then the media reports it the way they want to report it, and it's not our fault. But I think the reality is that, you know, politicians, leaders, people in important decision-making places are playing these kinds of games more. This is people from the US House of Congress playing CNAS's Taiwan game in 2023. They're leaving the room saying, that's what I learned from this game. This game told me. I observed game being played by senior politicians where they left the room saying just those kinds of things. I've learned from this game that China would do this. I've learned from this game the United States would do this. These are decision makers. And I watched the game and said, you can't learn that from this game. But you thought you did. And I think part of the problem is if we can't understand well enough how a game, what kind of lessons a game is producing, what kind of knowledge it's producing on the practitioner side, then it's going to be harder for us to be able to say to the clients, hey, just FYI, this game is not delivering what you think it's delivering. Because we ourselves are not clear about what's going on. I think that is perhaps the most pressing and significant one. And we may be designing games and we still don't know if you're actually teaching the lessons we want them to teach. So, what do we do about this? Well, this is not a new point. I'm not making a new point here. I'm just trying to clarify the state of play because this is a debate that has gone on. I mean, debate with a very small d. Like, this is not a huge literature. This is not thousands of scholars exchanging fire. This is, you know, dozens of scholars exchanging fire. But in so much as they exchange fire, we can identify two broad responses to the epistemological challenge of wargaming. One is what is, and this is normally framed as the art versus science debate. One side we have the artists. Now the artists here, essentially, broadly speaking, broad brushstrokes, this is representative of professional wargamers. Most professional wargamers either self-identify as artists of wargames or explicitly say wargaming is an art. And here, this is the urtext of wargaming. If you're going to start reading about wargaming, whatever your position, artist or scientist, you should read this one first. It is the foundational canonical text that is used in all wargaming professionally and academically. It's very good. I don't agree with Peter Perla on a lot of stuff. It doesn't mean it's not a very good book. It's a very good book. And it really lays out, I think, very effectively the artist's position on a lot of this sort of stuff. But the artist's position, in some ways, I'm going to have to, you know, summarize here, and I'm simplifying. All models are simplifications. And this is a model of the artist's view, is that essentially what artists do, they emphasize the narrative and immersive side of wargaming. They kind of frequently talk about the kind of story living experience of wargaming, how you kind of internalize lessons, how you experience things, and you learn from this, you gain insights. You'll hear the word insight. Like insights are used a lot. They're often very resistant to the concept of rigor. They very explicitly say you cannot apply rigor to this method. This is not rigorous, stop trying to do it. And they're very skeptical of comparative criticism. They're basically like, you can't compare these things. These are apples and oranges. these are all unique, bespoke designs. They're not going to be able to be compared with each other, and this is a waste of time. Now, I think there's a number of problems with this position. Firstly, I think they're responding to a narrow conception of science. In wargaming, professional wargaming, as I understand the contours of the terrain of that world, science is usually associated with operations research, which is usually associated with a highly quantified kind of statistical form of analysis. That's not what all science is, but I think that's the kind of science that professional wargamers are coming up against. So when they're arguing against the rigor of science, what they're actually doing is they're arguing against the rigor of a particular form or expression of a particular scientific philosophy, some form of neo-positivism or verificationism, right? So I think the fight's not as narrow as they think. That would be one part. The other part, I've said this point before, is that art's not immune from criticism. We have a rich and textured and layered and sophisticated language of art criticism across all the arts: cinema, theater, literature, poetry. So there's no get-out-of-jail-free card there. If you want to make the artist's claim and say this is an art, I would say at a minimum then, you're obliged to engage with those literatures, the literatures and artistic criticism. We kind of know that some movies are better than others and some books are better than others. We're able to do this. We're able to compare James Joyce's Ulysses with Dan Brown's various books and come up with some idea, but I think one of these is worth more. Obviously Dan Brown. No, I don't think that. But my final point here as well is that despite this sort of thing, saying, hey, we're artists, not scientists, you'll also see them making analytic claims. This game generated the following insights. We learned from this. The results show. That's the language of science. I'm sorry, you can't have it both ways. You can't say this is an art, not a science, and then make analytic claims. And so there's a danger here in that is that we're basically, they're leaving the question unanswered. Now, the scientist's response to this is really associated here, I'm going to say, with the academics. Academics here have been entering this space in the last 10 odd years, maybe a little bit longer, primarily from the discipline of international relations, which itself is a sub-discipline of political science. Why are the IR scholars getting into this? I think primarily because our subject matter is conflict focused inherently. It's typically about some form of who gets what, where, and why, some sort of power, some sort of distributional problems, fighting, conflict. So I think it's a kind of a natural fit. It's obvious to me that the IR people got here first and not, for example, maybe the sociologists. So how has that response been? And so, of course, the IR people here are reflecting the particular proclivities of the science of political science, which is its own set of commitments, which vary in different ways. And so how have they responded as they've seen this kind of epistemological challenge that wargaming is presenting? Well, one response has been to ignore it. Is to essentially say, that's not my problem. That's somebody else's problem. And so there's a few studies, and this would be a very prominent one, Would US Leaders Push the Button? It's a very, very good article. I highly recommend it, by Reid Pauly. And what Pauly does is he just gathers the data from war games that were run in some previous era by some previous set of institutions. These were games about nuclear weapons use that were run through the 60s and 70s, and then said, hey, these games generated synthetic data. Let's use this synthetic data to test existing theories we have in international relations theory about nuclear weapons use. So he essentially treats it as an unproblematic data set. Somebody else did these games. Here's what happened in these games. That's good enough for me. Let's go. Let's go ahead and use this. There's another piece by John Emery, which does a similar thing about nuclear weapons use. So it's just using somebody else's data from these games, ignoring any epistemological issues and saying, look, we recognize we're not quite sure how this works, but in so much as they generated some synthetic data, let's use that synthetic data. Another approach of this is the approach that I did. This is a project, you can see my name up here, along with Benjamin Jensen, a project on cyber operations and conflict that we did for the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, to imitate. This is how I came into analytic wargaming. And I was approached by Ben to ask to participate in this project. We each designed a game and used these games as the basis of an analytic report about the use of cyber weapons in conflicts. What did I do? Well, I read Peter Perlow. Right, I read Phil Saban. I read the people on professional wargaming. I said, how do I build a game? What do I do here? I mean, I have a hobby interest in gaming. I've taught them in class, but how do I do this properly? I imitated what the professionals were saying. I just did what they said. I said, look, I'm sure they know what the epistemology of this is. It's not for me to sort this out. If it's good enough for them, it's good enough for me. Let's go. I didn't really question the epistemology. I couldn't understand it. It seemed confusing to me, but I expected that somebody had solved these questions somewhere, in the same way that my stats textbook, if I dig deeply enough, somebody has the answer to the question of these 6 OLS assumptions. However, it's for some IR scholars, I think for good reason, that's not good enough. They need to feel that they're more confident about what they're doing. And so what they've done here is they've leaned on the logic of experimentalism. They've leaned on an existing set of scientific commitments that are familiar to themselves and familiar to the wider community. Now, this is not a criticism, this is actually a compliment. Because this is the only one of the three, and remember, I'm in group 2, all right? So, let's put everyone in their right box. They're the only one of the three that actually said, I need to have epistemological standards from the get-go. I can't just sort of say, hey, this is how it works, let's go. I've got to know, how am I producing knowledge? And so what they've done here is they've relied on the logic of experimentalism. Now, the logic of experimentalism, as I'm sure most of us know, is the very basic idea that you try to make an experiment in which you control for all factors of variance, of all factors of interest, except for the factor that you're interested in. So you want to figure out, does water cause plants to grow if you water them more? Well, what you want to do is you want to get the exact same seeds, you want to put them in the exact same size pot, you want to put them with the exact same soil and the same amount of it, you want to put them in a greenhouse with the exact same temperature. You want to control for every possible confounding variable or anything that could be distorting your results. Just the water, let's see do the seeds grow. This is a very respectable and effective mode of scientific inquiry. We shouldn't criticize it. This is where your pharmaceuticals come from. This is how we test drugs, right? This is how we do it. It's this method. Control for as much as possible, just the factor of interest. Let's go from there. Here's two prominent real-world IR examples of this. Here on the left is a game run by the Project on Nuclear Gaming, a game called Signal, which had both digital and paper copies of this game, in which they created it represents an abstract place, but it represents a real type of set of issues about nuclear weapons use and threats made with nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. And the game, as you can see here, is highly rigid, right? That is to say, everything is written down, the rules are all extremely clear and precise, suitable for digitization, essentially extremely effective for netting out every single individual data point. And then, of course, being able to create large, massive decision trees so you can capture every part of variance. You may or may not know if you're doing, every time you add a variable into a study like this, you've got to add cases. So the more variables you have, the more cases you have. Signal was run over 500 times. Here on the right, Hacking Nuclear Stability. This is an article that just came out in an international organization, which is, in my estimation, the premier journal in international relations of all. It's certainly in the top 3. This just came out in this quarter, and it's a game called Hacking Nuclear Stability, in which the authors have the players play 4 different scenarios, which vary on whether or not the participants have access to different kinds of nuclear ISR capabilities, which essentially either make them weaker or make them stronger against their opponent in the nuclear domain. Now, the problem with this is it requires a highly rigid design system, very, very rigid. The games have to be very, very rigid because if you're using the logic of experimentalism, well, then I've got to have every single data point nice and crisp and tidy. We can't have sort of, oh, this kind of happened, but that sort of happened. This happened definitely, this happened definitely. It becomes extremely prohibitive. The games are massive. We're talking hundreds of iterations. It's beyond the realm of most academics. If an academic could get a £5,000 grant, they're carried on their shoulders down the hall by their colleagues. We're looking at games here that had $1 million grants in excess of $1 million to be able to run these effectively. It's just not an effective way for academics to go forward. But that's an argument there about pragmatics. That's not an argument about philosophy. I think here the other problem is these games don't look like games. They don't look like games the way professional wargamers play them. And they don't look like the kinds of games that we know from history have been effective. We're not quite sure why they've been effective, but there's famous shibboleths, and I'm happy to talk about some of them in the Q&A, of games that were effective, that worked in identifying some sort of analytic problem, in discovering some sort of thing. They didn't look like this. They look like the professional people's games, right? They look like those other kinds of games. So there's clearly something going on in the professional games that does work sometimes, but we're not sure how it works. This move here, in order to kind of protect the results, it kind of kills the game. Hacking Nuclear Stability here is a very good example. This is a one-term game in which the players get to make one move and then kind of estimate what they think the consequences of that decision would be. Game ends. That's not really a very gamey game compared to some of the other games we can talk about. Right? There's not a huge amount of choices, not a huge amount of options. It makes sense through the logic of experimentalism. It's very clear. Right? And so now we have a problem here is that in order to save the results, we kill the game. Or we harm the game, might be a fair estimation of what I'm saying. Because I want to be very clear, I think the work is excellent. I just think that it's getting a little bit far away from gaming in order to fix the problem of epistemology. Now, the funny thing about this, maybe it's not that funny, but the interesting thing, again, maybe it's not that interesting, an observation about this, is the more I've thought about this and wrote about this, the more I realized actually that despite what appears to be a very clear set of disagreements between the scientists and the artists, they actually have some kind of very fundamental areas of agreement that took me a while to discover and then to appreciate. One of them is that they essentially engage in what's known as syntactic explanation. So when we think about how scientific or explanation works in general, we can identify different forms of explanation. Pragmatic explanation, we do it because it's useful. Semantic explanation, we make something sensible in a new way. Syntactic explanation, it's right because you did it the right way. Right? We know it's right because you did it the way you're supposed to do it. I've said to my students before, I think if there's a syntax of explanation in the War Studies department, to which incidentally I should subscribe, it's not criticism, it's observation, it's verificationism. How do I know that your dissertation is good enough? Well, you had a clearly articulated argument, in theory. You had you had data that was properly sourced. You mapped your theory to the data well. You showed how it explained the outcome, and you also showed how it explained the outcome better than one or two prominent alternatives. That's it. That's the syntax. Do it like that, you will get your PhD. Don't do it like that. Get ready for people going, I don't think this is right. Why didn't you do this? Where's the evidence? Right? It's a syntactic explanation. We know it's right because you did it the right way. Historians, I went to the archives. I learned 4 languages. If you don't learn 4 languages, or 2 languages, or 1 language, and go to the archives, you will not get your history PhD. It doesn't matter how good your evidence is. You have to do it the way we do it. So they're both syntactic. It's just their syntax is different. The syntax of professionals is, how did you build a game? And if you read a lot of these books, like Peter Pearl and Phil Sabin, they talk about epistemology. It's there. I'm not saying they don't talk about it. They talk about purpose. They talk about fitting the game to where your goal, all that sort of stuff. They do talk about it. That's not what I'm saying. It's that where they get really kind of complex and get into the weeds, is they get into the weeds and they talk about, here's how you build it. Let's go building. Let's build a game. And I'm going to walk you through what you need to have. Here's the pieces you need to have to make your game work. That's their syntax. The syntax of academics is, trust me, right? Trust me. I did it the way you told me to do it. You said give you crisp, clear results. This has to be precise. The appendix for hacking nuclear stability is longer than the article. It walks you through every single survey that was sent out, every question, every move. It's all there. It's all there. You should believe me. It's there. But the emphasis then is on the production of the knowledge. And because we don't have a worked out epistemology at the moment, I think quite understandably the default has been to refer back to existing practices and ways we have of netting out experimental data, which is experimentalism. And so they are both syntactic in the way they think about this problem. Think about if you do it the right way, it'll kind of solve itself. But there's the other thing they do, which I also find quite surprising, is they rely on other methods to solve the problem. They go, well, okay, if you're not sure, then okay, you're going to put it into some sort of cycle of research. We're going to have it validated out an actual field exercise. Or let's see what the analysts say. Let's see how it compares to the operational analysis that was done. Or the academics will say, we also did some case studies, or we surveyed experts. But my kind of criticism here is you're still outsourcing the problem, right? Instead of sort of saying, hey, you should trust my game because it works for these reasons, you say, hey, you should trust my game because it works for their reasons, right? Like the analysts looked at it and they also agreed. Or, when I looked at case studies, that said I was right. That's not giving me a reason to believe your method. It's giving me a reason to accept that your method appears to align with some other methods, but still what's going on inside your method is a bit of a black box. I still don't understand why your game is right without you referencing these other methods. So there's 2 problems here, which have different levels of seriousness depending on how much this sort of keeps you awake at night. One of them is this means the problem's not going to resolve itself. The more it becomes a syntactic problem, hey, just keep doing it the right way and it'll solve itself, the more it stays unresolved because no one's really trying to think about what is about wargaming that produces knowledge. In one case, you're like, who cares? It's not an issue we need to worry about, or it's unresolvable. The other side say, I don't know how a wargame produces knowledge, but I know how to produce knowledge. So I'm going to make it produce knowledge the way I know how to produce knowledge, and then the wargame kind of recedes a bit into the background as the kind of key design factor here. The other problem here is it's going to lead to divergence between the groups. The more this continues, the more the 2 versions of gaming will become unrecognizable to one another, and the more they'll keep talking across purposes. And in so much as we might want to have some sort of exchange of ideas and collaboration and innovation and moving the ball forward, they're singing right past one another because they're basically saying, you've got to do it this way. If you don't do it this way, it's not going to work. So what is a way that we can possibly get out of this conundrum? Not the way, a way. Because as I said, all the questions are waiting to be answered. And I constantly say to my students, anything I think now, I may think something completely different for 2 to 3 years because this is a moving intellectual target and my own ideas about this are constantly in flux. But here's where I stand today. Firstly, we need to reaffirm our scientific commitments. Now, a commitment to scientific rigor is not a commitment to quantification. It is not. I've done methods. I perfectly accept the way it works. I never use statistics in my own research beyond descriptive statistics because I don't agree with the way it's bending reality. I can't accept some of the assumptions that statistics is making, especially with international relations research evidence, which is highly conceptual, so it's really problematic when you start turning into numbers. So I can't use it, right? But I understand what it is, and I don't think that's the be-all and end-all of scientific rigor. Instead, we need to have a broader conception here of scientific rigor, and here I refer to Patrick Thaddeus Jackson in his book, The Logic of Inquiry in International Relations. This is a book that's already been quite important in shaping the debate, the nascent debate on epistemology in wargaming. Most notably, it's used by Elizabeth Bartels, who's at RAND as their senior wargamer. Very interesting, straddles maybe the only person who effectively straddles the space between academia and professional wargaming. She fits into both clubs very well. And she uses PTJ's book, she uses PTJ's book to try to come up with a more expansive epistemology of wargaming. I'm not going to go into all of PTJ's details. I'm going to have to talk about it in the Q&A. But the basic point here for Patrick Jackson is you don't need to have a universal approach. There's no universal approach to science. It's not an empirically supported statement. Scientific disciplines don't all do it the same way. What biologists do is not what chemists do, is not what physicists do. They have different commitments, different fundamental commitments about what counts for knowledge production. What does matter is that once you've accepted those initial commitments, that you commit to them properly, and that means you have to follow research according to a certain set of practices once you've made those initial commitments. Those initial commitments are leaps of faith, essentially. They're not statements of fact. Once you've made them, though, you've got to do it transparently, you've got to report those results clearly, and you've got to make sure they can be evaluated. There's got to be some way. Once you've made that opening position of, hey, this is the way I think we produce knowledge, then you've got to do it that way, right? You can't have it both ways. You can't sort of say, well, I don't believe in positivism, so I don't believe in anything. You've got to pick a team, you've got to pick something, and then you've got to say, according to this approach, this is what would make sense. So it makes sense to the people who buy into these kinds of explanations. Maybe if you don't buy into these explanations, it's not going to make sense to you. And this is why we have methods that are very different from each other, like ethnography and statistics, but that have evolved and developed in very sophisticated ways in their own disciplines, right? They have not been the same and stagnant for 100 years. They keep evolving all the time because once they've made that initial commitment, they're able to use it transparently, report it clearly, and be able to understand how they're evaluating through it. So they also know critically how to improve those evaluations. You cannot just say, trust us. You can't just say, trust us. That's what the game shows. I don't know what the game shows. I'm not clear. I'm reading these reports. I've yet to read one, except for Hacking Nuclear Stability, in which I was completely clear about exactly what happened in that game, all the way front and back, and I know how you got your results. And so it's hard, and we can't just do that. So what is something we can do? Well, one thing here, and this is what I propose in the article, is that we try to recognize what I call the methodological machinery of wargaming. Now, what am I talking about when I talk about the methodological machinery of wargaming? This is taken from a concept, this is a derivative of a concept called epistemic machinery, which is a concept by a scholar called Karen Noor Katina. I'm going to quote here, but I also have the slide quote, if somebody would like to see it better after Q&A. It refers to the different architectures of empirical approaches, specific constructions of the referent, particular ontologies of instruments, and different social machines used by individual disciplines in the production of knowledge. Right? Epistemic machineries are the whole total set of intellectual, practical, technical, procedural commitments that, say, physicists make, that experimental physicists make, that theoretical physicists make, that game theorists make, that economists make. It's that whole package. It's the whole thing you've got to kind of buy into, not just what you believe, but how you think you're producing the knowledge, the actual techniques, the machines, if there's machines, the mechanisms. Now, I don't use the word epistemic machinery because my position is we don't have an epistemic machinery because we don't really know our epistemology well enough. We're moving too fast already. Now, the response currently, the example here would be the academics, also Elizabeth Bartels, well, let's talk about epistemology. Let's get going and talk about, if you're a positivist wargamer or if you're a reflexivist wargamer, how does this work? It's a top-down mode of epistemology. Now, I think the danger of this approach is, and we've already seen it with the experimentalists, is that in a hurry to fix the method to the epistemology, the method is the thing that gets pruned away. right? You're fixing it. I already know it's got to be like this. Now conform. You have to fit my shape, and then I'll know you were the right game. But on doing it, you might turn it less and less into something that we recognize and consider a game, and instead we're just turning it into a glorified experiment or a form of case study analysis, which is kind of using synthetic data, whatever it is, right? It's fitting something else's frame. So what I instead is I propose that we start from the bottom up. We identify the methodological machinery of wargaming. That is the things that we see inside wargames, and we move up from there. Now, what do I mean by the methodological machinery? I'm talking here about the prominent, not unique, but prominent elements of wargaming that distinguish it from other methodological approaches. What is it about a wargame that is actually quite distinct from a case study, that is distinct from a game theoretic model, that is distinct, or not distinct, but like noticeably different at a minimum, in some cases genuinely distinct, but noticeably different from a lot of these other methods, and start from these on their own and consider if and how they produce knowledge. Instead of just saying, hey, it does do this, let's see how it does this, or if it does this, and if it does it well. And so I've currently identified 5 of these methodological machineries, each of which holds potential for the production of knowledge, and each of which generates challenges for the effective production of knowledge. So what I'll do here very quickly is I'm going to talk through these and talk through what the promise of these is and what the pitfalls of these are, and how I will contend we don't actually know yet sufficiently well how the promise is made good on and how the pitfalls are dodged. One here is that all games are representative. This would be my claim. Is that all games are referring to real or potentially real events. Now, the events might be empirical events, what would happen if China invaded Taiwan. They might be abstract conceptual events, how does deterrence work? But they're a reference to some sort of real type of dynamic or a reference to some sort of real actual event. So they represent something else. They're a form essentially of modeling. Now, the value of this that's always put forward, to which incidentally I should say, I'm a believer, right? I'm trying to find my faith, is that this gives us more external validity in an analytic game. Let's make it like the thing it is, as much as like the thing it is, and then people will behave like the thing that they're supposed to be. We're not just going to some random thing. I want to understand what happens in crisis escalation. Let's make a game about escalation. And let's get all the dynamics of escalation in, and let's see what happens, right? It's going to be this like laboratory where we can sort of test these things out. I want to know what's going to happen in an invasion. That's theological, right? It's this representativeness is its strength, not its weakness. Game theoretic models are purely abstract, right? They're very, very far away from reality, and then they get a frame put around them. Case studies are the real thing. This is somewhere in between, right? Somewhere in between those things. The downside is, how do we know you're representing it the right way? How do we know that your representation is a good fit? You can't just sort of say, well, we know this is what happened at the time, so we'll put all this stuff in the order of battle, and we made sure these are the 3 countries, and here we go. Right? That's descriptive, right? That's not a justification for your representation. That's just telling me what's in your representation. So we know that this is what they are. We don't know how I know one representational component is better. We also don't necessarily know what happens when, for example, we give players a board. We have a lot of intuitive knowledge on this, absolutely. But like, what happens when the board ends at this point, right? People can't play beyond a certain space. What happens when you don't represent certain things on the board? This here is a game, Iran's Hegemony, which is a game, a semi-professional game you can buy commercially, about how the US hedges against the threats of particular actors, North Korea, Iran, China, and Russia. It's a very particular idea of what politics is and who matters and who's going to make decisions and what kind of decisions they're making. There's a lot of stuff and bias and belief baked into this, which is kind of implicit, right? It's kind of common sense. Yeah, well, of course. But like, it's better to be more precise about this. And if you're not, it could be generating all sorts of bias outcomes or outputs, ways of playing that you haven't taken seriously. In fact, I should note that when I pointed out the Signal game, Andrew Reddy, who's one of the lead designers of that game, intentionally made it orange, green, and purple, whatever the colors are, of random countries. Because if you made it Russia and America, people played a particular way. In fact, even if you made it blue and red, people thought, well, I know blue means, the West, and red means the West's enemies. So you have to they're trying to take out everything that would confound. And in fact, one of the problems they recognize is that people were still kind of seeing Europe, right? They kind of saw Eurasia in that top bit and kind of saw America in the free-floating country anyway. So that's one feature. They're representative. That's not a unique, it's a very prominent feature. We need to understand better how to do that properly, how to make sure that your representation is capturing the essential parts of your game, subject to the purpose of your game as you've stated it, and how it's not folding in the wrong stuff, how you can defend that design in a much more fundamental way. The second part of this is that they have consequence-based decision making. And this is also very, very different. If anything, this is probably one of the most distinct features of wargaming from other methods. You have human players in the loop, and that you have at least one human player who makes at least one consequential decision. I think, more advanced games, most typically professional games, you have a number of human players, and you have a number of turns. But that's the key idea, is they make a move, and then they live with the choices that are made. Now, why is this a valuable or interesting feature of the way wargames produce knowledge? Well, they allow for truly creative play, right? The example I often use is, if you've ever played chess, think about how hard it is to play a game of chess against yourself, right? You can't surprise yourself, really. You can test out strategies, but you can't really surprise yourself. You can't really go, oh, I wonder how I noticed that I'm setting up to, kill the person's queen with the bishop if they just move their knight. You have no idea. It's your idea. And you can't see it. But when you play somebody else in a game of chess, whether you're better than them or worse than them, something will happen that you can't predict, right? If you can get past the first 4 or 5 moves of a game of chess and you haven't got your opponent in check, something is going to happen on that board that you didn't anticipate. Maybe they're playing even worse than you thought. Whatever it is, it's something that's new and creative. This is considered one of the great values of wargaming, is the possibility of genuine creative play, which can generate new kinds of knowledge that nobody anticipated going into the game. The players, the designers, the facilitators, nobody knew this was going to happen, and it happened. That's very valuable. The problem is that people are playing a game, right? And so we have problems here with the way people actually play games. What happens if they're frustrated with the rules, right? How do we know that the reason they're not making choices is because they're confused by something rather than because they don't want to make that choice? How do we know they're not playing to win? How do we know they're not playing to avoid losing? What's actually motivating their play? Are they really playing thinking they're America making an important invasion, or are they just trying to beat red? And in fact, one of the most famous examples of one of the data problems in this is the problem of last turn madness, where very often as the game is ending, people will start going nuts. And I've had many students come up to me and say in the last turn of the game, how do we launch nukes? The game is ending, let's throw the Hail Mary pass, let's go for it. Now, I hope that's not what happens in real politics, is that you sort of say, well, the game is ending. Maybe you do, if you're looking at your own morning coil. Let's throw the ball. You get the point. This is a problem. In fact, in the Signal game, they run the test and they net out, they compare the results when they remove the last turn of play to see if play changes significantly, and they observe that it does. People start to play differently. These are real problems. We can't just kind of, we know they exist. We need to come up with controls for them. We need to come up with ways of addressing them, knowing if we think they're present, knowing if they are not, knowing what that means for the evaluation of the results, that you can say to the reader, hey, FYI, Blue was really going for it today. We think that they were in gamer mode. You can discount the results a little bit as a consequence. What's one of the other prominent features? Now remember, if you read any book, by the way, of wargaming, you'll see a lot of these things. The difference here I'm making is I'm identifying them as conceptual features of the method, not just as things inside of a game. This is not design features, as I'm articulating. These are ways in which the game produces knowledge. And the other feature, of course, is that they're adjudicated. Games are adjudicated. Now, in actual professional wargaming, most games are some form of loose games. That is to say, they have some or maybe no rules fully formally written down. They're going to have some sets of rules that are kind of in protocol. If you use this weapon, we're going to use this chart. But very often they're very loosely adjudicated, where you have, in principle, the right subject matter experts in the room. Sort of say, okay, they want to use the hypersonic missile. Let's ask the hypersonic missile button. Would it work? How would it work? Let's get that going. In very rigid games, you have all the rules written down. This here is one of the sub-games of the active threshold game that we ran for NATO. This is a diplomatic game called Global Positioning. Here, all the rules are written down. All the choices you can make are only the choices the game will let you make. Now, the problem of adjudication is very obvious. The adjudicators are God. They are determining the reality, either in the rigid game, in which it is the voice of God when you open the little box and take out the piece of paper, like this and only this. Even in the loose games with SMEs, they are the ones who are shaping what's happening inside the model. So you're actually building the model in real time. And we need to have more effective ways of netting out, have you selected the correct SMEs? SMEs means subject matter expert, subject matter expert SME. Have you selected the right SMEs? Are you sure it's the SMEness that's operative at the moment you ask them the question? There's a long and healthy and frightening literature on how experts make decisions in all sorts of ways only partially related to their expertise. Right? Ask somebody when they're tired and they'll go, yeah. Right? They'll give a different answer. That's not a huge issue if you're just playing an educational game. If you're going to stand behind the results and say, hey, that's what the SME said, we need to have a clear understanding. actually how this stuff is being produced in a reasonably systematic way. And also evaluating, I should say here. You know, we can do tests and start to understand what happens when this adjudication is working in different ways. How bad is it if we have a SME that is not being given a strict set of protocols? Is there a downside risk of not making them argue out their point, or does it tend to work out? We can test these assumptions. We can do experiments. We can do various ways of figuring these things out. Perhaps the other most unique feature of gaming that's often held out by both academics and professional wargamers is that they're immersive or maybe engaging. I'm not sure how much I'm even committed to the word engaging, immersive anymore. This here is a picture of a game called Jaws of the Dragon, which is designed and executed by one of our PhDs here, Evan, in front of us, who's doing his research right now on how immersion is produced in wargames, the different ways it's produced, what it is, what effect it's having, what happens when it comes in different forms. This is held out very axiomatically, right, without contention. Games are immersive. That means they have greater ecological validity. That means you can believe the results more because people are acting like the thing that they are in the game. Is that true? We don't know. We don't know. It's plausible. I can see how it could be true. I could also see ways in which certain immersive mechanisms might make it more true for some people. I could see how certain immersive mechanisms might complement one another to create the immersion more. I could imagine ways in which certain immersive mechanisms actually contradict one another and pull the players in different directions. I don't think we can just wave our hand and say, it's fine. I had a bunch of flags in the room. We dimmed the lights. You know, let's go. It's, do you know what you're doing? I think probably one of the problematic things that Evan's discovering in his research as he tells me about it is probably most people get immersed in different ways. Now what, right? And now what are you going to do? Because some people will respond to the mood and the lighting. Other people are going to get immersed by the actual nature of the interactions they're engaging in. This is generating different kinds of behavior on the parts of the players. That's your results, right? If the players are behaving differently because they're getting immersed in different ways, that's not incidental, that's critical. And lastly, games are bespoke. Now this here is my recognition that the artists, in some ways, are right. Games are all different. Right? These are the bespoke designs. Now, I think quite fairly, one of the reviewers of my piece was like, hey, all scientific endeavors fail. Absolutely, right? So, you know, you're not some sort of drone because you're using other methods. But I think what's really interesting about wargames is the grammar of wargaming is so elaborate. The ways of doing a game are, there's many, many different ways. Not just the looseness or the rigidity, it's what you want to commit, what you want to turn into a map, what you want to turn into a chart, how you're going to represent actions. This here are my initial sketches for the games that we built for At the Threshold, right? This is my notebook. This actually, I showed you that global positioning game earlier. That's it there, right, in its first form. They're all different than each other, right? They're all, now, many of them, as is many the case with most wargame designers, they're magpie thief designs, just robbing blindly and, you know, unapologetically from other designs. There is a lot of real difference here in the games. That does generate a comparative problem. But I don't think it's as strong as people think. Because I think all we have to do is kind of one step above the language of specific designs, cards, hexes, areas, point to point, and we can find a more coherent meta language just one step above it. In fact, some of that language is already there. I used the language earlier of rigid versus loose games. That's an example here of a way of comparing one game to another that's not a reference to some sort of design feature. It's a reference to some sort of property of the game. This game is rigid. All the rules are written down. This game is loose. This game is a free Kriegspiel, which is a mix of those things. There's actually comparative language that already exists. I can think of a whole different form of meta-comparative language that would work. We could talk about things like representative fidelity. Is the game a plausible representation of its subject based on its own purpose? Purpose of fit. Does it fit its purpose? Theoretical alignment. Do the rules or the SMEs line up with the existing theories or the existing understandings of this problem as they were understood before the game was run? How does the game engage its players? What are the narrative drivers? What causes the game to move in particular directions? What are the impact of those things? How do they link back to the original purpose of the design? These are not statements about did you use cards or did you use hexes. It's about which of these mechanics were propelling the game to generate the outcomes and how do you defend the existence of the propellant, not the existence of the mechanic, if you understand what I'm saying. So I think, now this is suggestive, it's not even something I use, but it's a sense that I think there's a language just one step above the language of design, but considerably and hopefully usefully many steps below the language of experimentalism that can capture something that is truly comparative and evaluative amongst games. So where does this leave us going forward? Well, you know, I've been working on this for a number of years, right? This is my first meaningful wargaming publication, and it's taken me quite some time to think this through, right? It's not immediately obvious, any of this stuff, at least to me. But one of the advantages of this approach, and we're definitely pitching this around to funders, is it offers a path towards some preliminary epistemological research. That's 5 things. We can start by at least understanding those 5 things. We can start there. That's 5 postdocs or PhDs that could be funded to just study those things. Evan's already here doing immersion. That's 1 of 5. Right, 1 down, 4 to go. It's a beginning. And once we start trying to understand how these things work on their own, we might be able to start thinking how they work together or work against one another. Because there's a very good reason to think that sometimes they're pulling in opposite directions. Maybe some of the dynamics that make the game highly playable and engaging might actually pull it away from its represented nature. We could see that there's actually could be tensions inside these things, which would make future wargame designers say, I have to choose engagement over this. I have to choose that over this, rather than just saying, here we go, everything into the hopper because I think it looks good. You actually start to say, I have to be judicious. I have to limit what I can include, and here's why I made those limitations. And then, of course, this also, as I say, is very pragmatic, putting out my little begging bowl at the end of the lecture. This is a way of getting funding, right? This is a program where, I can't do this on my own, Anna can't do this on her own. None of us can do this on our own. This is a program for other researchers to be able to say, well, I think I can handle one of these things. Give me the funding, and I'll take care of that for the next 3 or 4 years. And then hopefully we'll be in a better position to be able to answer that. That's exactly what we're doing here. Aggie Hurst, who's one of the founding members of the Wargaming Network here, our kind of academic star player, her and I have just submitted a grant to fund this project, but hopefully we're going to be able to submit some more money for research grants. If you'd like to know more before we turn to the Q&A, that's the article. It's not out yet. It's not even in pre-publication yet, but I was promised by the editors it's forthcoming in March. So you can look out for it. International Studies Review, where it comes out. That's its much more tedious academic title. And this is various, I think, places you can contact me or the Wargaming Network more widely. But we still have 25 minutes for some Q&A. So I hope people would like to do so.
All right, thank you so much for that talk. So we are going to have 2 minutes for Q&A. Evan has got some microphones so that we can hear you. So we'll start right here.
Hello. Oh, right, that's loud. Thank you, David. That was very interesting. I've got a question and an observation regarding the confidence problem. Mm-hmm. So I spent quite a lot of time dealing with that issue in various professional war games that I've run. I wondered if you had ever come across the evidence framework approach, if that rings any bells to you. So it's something that Paul Pierce at the STL put together, which allows you to do verification and validation on war game structures. Mm-hmm. And it finishes off with something called a confidence assessment table, where you do a confidence assessment in the results that you are producing. And it's interesting because it's the only example I know of that actually speaks to that confidence problem. I've never seen anything else look at it. And I've also never seen anything else. It also isn't particularly widely used. It's a qualitative assessment, and it may not even tick enough of the rigor of boxes from your perspective, but it is academically published. Yeah. So it is something that can be looked at. And I don't think it was initially set up for wargaming either. But I think it was interesting because your discussion really resonated with me, because it's a problem that we grappled with a lot. And there are no good answers to that. It's an exception that does not disprove anything that you've said. I think it really sits in with what you said, in that there are some people on the other side who also have recognized that problem. And then there are a small number of mechanisms that exist to counter it, but they're very infrequently applied. And academically, I think they do stand up. But I think it would be quite an interesting thing to work into some of this stuff that you're talking about.
Can you give me the name of that again?
The evidence framework approach. So Paul Pierce published it by, I think, Durham University. So you can Google that one and find it. But I'd be happy to potentially have a discussion with you on how that is used by wargaming professionals. Yeah. And the answer is not very much, but it exists.
So I confess, if I've read it, I've forgotten it.
No, it's fine.
It sounds vaguely familiar, but I don't remember it off the top of my head. I am aware of the one that's used in NATO, which is like DCAP or DCMP or something. I have it on my laptop. But
I don't know that one.
I know that the way that one works, and that's not what you just said, but it does have a kind of a step of things you need to do to kind of put into your model to make it kind of convincing. So I'm aware of these kinds of practices.
Yeah.
I will say maybe two things on this. One is, at least in my experience with that particular framework, is it's not quite clear. It's sort of intuitive and clear why I'm choosing the things, right? And they're kind of conceptual things. It's not just, have your scenario or your orbats. It's kind of like, what is your kind of puzzle? What are the key dynamics? What are the key relationships? It's just that it's not quite clear what you're supposed to do beyond that statement, right? So they kind of give you the things you should be concerned about. What isn't kind of behind that is a language of why you should be concerned about it, right? You need to fill these boxes in, not just because I'm asking you to, because if you don't, you'll create this distortion. If you do, you'll create this benefit. And part of my work is motivated by a book that has an extraordinarily tedious name, but it's an excellent book called Process Tracing Methods. I mean, if that doesn't make you want to fall asleep, I don't know what will. But it's an excellent book by two scholars called Beach and Pedersen. This book was really helpful when I was writing my dissertation many years ago, because what they do is they say, look, it's about case studies. You want to do case studies. But if you want to do case studies to do comparative case studies, you have to do it like this. If you want to do case studies because you want to do a single case analysis, you need to do it like this. And what they do is they walk you through why each of those trade-offs matter. Like why this is important for your research, because you can't produce this kind of knowledge if you do it this way, but it's perfectly fine if you're doing it for this method. Don't worry about any of this kind of stuff. So I think what I'm aware of with these frameworks is a sense of the problem, but not a sense of exactly what the distortion will be, what this really means for your results. I'm very heartened about the confidence idea. I do think the way out of this in terms of confidence is, I don't think this is a story about quantification. I think I would be quite weirded out.
The framework is very qualitative in a way that I think you might say isn't rigorous enough, and that would be a fair comment. But it's at least something in a world where there isn't very much.
Intelligence frameworks are a really useful guide here, where they'll say things like high probability, medium probability. I think that's fine. I think that's kind of what you end up with at the end of it. You end up with a qualitative assessment of, this is how confident we are in the results that we have produced via this war game. Yeah. I think the other point, though, I'd want to say on this, and this gets to this kind of the separation between academics doing this and the wargaming world in general. I've done a lot of industry research with professional wargamers as part of my project on SMEs, and I would not claim this is not something that's being considered in professional wargaming. Absolutely. I've had some really great conversations where people were having like very, very sophisticated discussions about epistemology, and I'd say, this is amazing. Where can I read this? It's on my laptop. I've never sent it anywhere because I think the incentives are different. Right? I accept that claim, that criticism from one of my reviewers of, I don't have time for this. I think that's right. I actually don't think this is a problem for professionals to solve. You are busy being professionals. You've got deliverables that aren't kind of, how many angels on the head of a pin. The incentive structure of academia is very different. We can do this. Right? We're rewarded for this. I get a pat on the head for getting a publication. So I think that there's also an issue here. I'm not trying to sort of criticize. It's more identifying, right, where we need to go next, or where I would. And also, part of that is that these kinds of best practices are disseminated in publications and not just in these kind of, you find it on Google Scholar or somebody says, hey, have you read? And that you would have automatically known, hey, if you're going to do this, these are the things you need to read. But thank you.
Thanks for a fascinating talk on an area that I think is very relevant, not only in wargaming, but in the broader field of games generally. You mentioned, talking about approaches to criticism, that there's a rich and layered language of criticism across all of the arts. And yet games, which is an 8,000-year-old field, does not have that vocabulary of criticism. Why do you think that is?
Well, I mean, I think the language of criticism is there in commercial games, right? You can watch really sophisticated. I mean, I shut up and sit down is a website I go to frequently, and they'll give you a good review of a game. I think the difference is their core evaluative metric is this fun, right? I think people who are familiar with wargaming literature will know that this is the kind of big distinction: educational, analytic, fun. And the get out of jail free card for fun games is always, well, it's fun, right? Hey, this isn't realistic, it's fun. Hey, there's too many rules, that's our definition of fun. They're always able to get out that way, which I think is perfectly acceptable. I say as a hobby wargamer, I don't need this to be real, I need this to be fun. Fun might be 50 pages of rules, but that's still fun. So I think there's a bit of a language of game analysis in that way, but I guess the point I'm trying to get at here is that I don't think even in the kind of commercial gaming world, we have a language of like kind of quality. Right, that just because this game sold 100 copies or 1,000 copies is it good or bad, and whereas we do have that, I think, with literature, and we do have that with. I think in particular here, I think there's probably a lot to be gained for gaming for taking stuff out of dramaturgy, especially on the concept of things like immersion. Because I often make the analogy that gaming, board gaming, and professional wargaming by extension is to theatre what video games is to cinema. In that there's a huge requirement when you participate in an analog game of any kind for you to bring a lot of the reality to the game. Right? You have to turn these pieces into something more meaningful than themselves. In a movie or in a video game, it's all given to you. It's like, here we go, Call of Duty, take it or leave it. But in a board game, you've got to be there and participate in the creation of that experience. And so I think there's probably a lot to be learned from the art of dramaturgy in effective criticism, because that's exactly, I mean, I've always said the worst play in the world is worse than the worst movie in the world, but the best play in the world is better than the best movie in the world, right? Like when a play lands, it'll land better than a movie ever will, but when you can't stop seeing the exit sign and recognizing people eating boiled sweets, it's intolerable. And I think there's probably a lot to learn from that.
Thank you.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. My question is about results. Should we be more interested in the results of war games, as in what happened in the game, or should we be more interested in what having played the game does to the participants in terms of what it does, how it changes their thinking and how it changes their actions, either in other experiments or in their evaluations of the game?
So I think that's what you're getting there is a kind of to a classic what's the purpose of the game kind of question, right? I mean, if it's an educational game, you want people to learn something, right? And so that's very often rigid games are very good for that because it might be a very specific lesson you're trying to teach them. This is, I want you to learn this particular model of negotiation. So I'm going to build that game, the game that reflects that model, and then negotiate that way. And so you want them to have that experience. I think, on an analytic game, just like we're going to make claims about something outside of this room, the results matter, right? Because you're making claims about this is what I think might happen if China gets invaded. But I think as a follow-up interesting point on this, and I hope, well, I won't say who, but I talked to a very prominent wargaming expert about this. And the way she said it was, I think a wargame has succeeded if I see that the organization is using the results in some way. She considers that to be a success. The success is, did they care? And if they cared, chalk it up as a win. And if they didn't, don't. And kind of in a framework, that's kind of almost like a critical theory approach to understanding the value of wargaming. Did it change something in the real world? If so, it was a good game. If not, it wasn't. So there, in fact, it's not about results at all. It's about genuine impact. That's the measure she uses, which I think is very interesting.
Sorry, it's a bit cheating here, but a follow-up to that is one aspect of evaluating people's response to a game is not just whether they've learned some data about the world, but whether they've picked up some kind of skills, whether the game has equipped them in some way to think differently or behave differently. And so rather than, I think this is tension, the sort of whether you're trying to be representative of the game, or the game like Go or some abstract game is trying to teach people to think more strategically or link certain concepts together. So that's just a bit of tension there I'm trying to identify there between the sort of...
Well, I mean, for what it's worth, the literature on this is not very clear. And in fact, one of the other PhDs who's not here today, Buki Kistemacher, is doing exactly this. How do individuals and organizations learn from games? It should be something that we kind of, we already know the answer, but actually there's not a systematic response to that question. And so she's trying to get a coherent understanding of under what conditions do both individuals kind of internalize the lessons, but also organizations, right? The wider organization that ran the game, when will they kind of take it in and bring it into their organizational thinking or planning, and when will it just get discarded? We don't have a clear answer. I mean, this is like, this is frustrating. I mean, I don't think any of my students are in that class right now. I think they very sensibly went home. They had 2 hours of this earlier. Is that we don't know the answer to a lot of these questions. I'm of the position that we raise our hand and say we don't know. I don't think that we can't know. That's the difference. I think we can know. I just think we have to just do it, and we'll figure the answers to these questions out. I'd be highly surprised if we get to the end of all of this and discover that war games don't do anything. And that, the last thing I do before I write that paper is they kick me out of my office. I think there's a there. And furthermore, when I say a there, I mean the there of the professional style of war games. That representative, the adjudication. I'm trying to focus in on those things that we do see in the real practice. Not just say, well, this is not going to work. It's not going to fit the epistemological boxes. So let's see how it works, and let's see if we can't reconcile it with different epistemological commitments instead of just throwing it away.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting. I had a question about sort of scientific rigor in a non-quantitative way.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about reproducibility in war games? Like, I think that occurs to me as a way that science sort of non-quantitatively compares sort of studies and how rigorous they might be. Do you think that can apply to war games?
Yeah, I think so, absolutely. I mean, I don't think you can necessarily reproduce the same, you can't guarantee, if it was a game that had, say, multiple turns and multiple players, well, you can't guarantee you'll get the same results of the game. I think what you should be able to do is you should be able to have access to the game materials. And in fact, the Hoover Institute at Stanford is building this archive right now of just, send us your games and we will keep them in a database and people can access them so that I could at least, for example, do what we might consider a playthrough. Okay, you said this happened in your game. Let me take out all the pieces and let me kind of walk through and see if I can replicate those results. You said they rolled a 5, I'll roll a 5 here. To make sure that so in that sense, it should be reproducible, in the sense that I should have access to the game, I should have access to the materials that are associated with the game, so that if I wanted to, I could take it out and say, okay, I can see how this worked. Current practices, again, this is largely because it's not really an academic discipline, it's a professional discipline. Quite understandably, sponsors are going to be like, I'm not paying £1 million for a game and then just having it out on the market for my competitor to take, and we paid for it, it's ours. I get that, but I think the problem with that is that we don't know, right? It turns into trust me, and you're like, I want to trust you, I think there's a there, but there's not enough in this report for me to trust you, so I actually have to just go, and that's frustrating.
Thank you for the talk again. My question relates to the place of AI in wargaming.
Mm-hmm.
So I've read a few articles and spoken with a few people who very much see the potential of AI to fuel immersion, fuel analytics. And it strikes me as a field where it would be pretty obvious that you'd be thinking about how do we know things, because black box problem is a huge problem with AI in general.
Yes.
So what's the contribution of that field in wargaming?
So here, I'm just going to put this slide up so we all remember the 5 things. It's really good. And if you're not already aware of it, there's a report by the Turing Institute, CETAS, C-E-T-A-S, I can't remember what that stands for. But it's associated with the Turing Institute, and they've done a really excellent report on AI and wargaming that came out over the summer, in which they interviewed a lot of professional wargamers and academics in wargaming and AI experts to kind of get a sense of what's going on right now and kind of what would happen if we started to integrate AI. I think the place for most professional wargamers, and certainly where I would be from an epistemological position, is I think it would be great for helping with things like data analysis, right? I mean, I could see a way in which if you had a sophisticated microphone rig and cameras and stuff in a room, the AI could be helping say, hey, you need to zero in on this moment of the game, or there's something really interesting happened here. I think where I think the AI is probably going to be less useful is in almost any of the other 4 things. And precisely for the reason you said, which is why did you do what you did? Now, we know that the AI can talk to us in a language we understand, right? AI is a program to communicate with us so that we understand them. But the problem is that's not how they're actually thinking. So when you ask the AI, hey AI, how did you think that up? They'll go, well, how do I say this to a human? And then they'll give you your answer. They don't actually say, this is how I did it. And to me, that is an immediate, as you say, a black box problem. That's a transparency problem. So now I don't know. So this is why I think you can't have AI as players. I think there's a space for AI as adjudicators. I think the best space for AI adjudicators is that if you knew ahead of time that you really should have adjudicators, SMEs on climate security and refugees and whatever it is, and you don't have them on the day, and you know ahead of time, and this gets to the idea that you have a clear idea of your representation going in, I should have them, I don't have them, then I think you could lean a bit on the AI. So we don't have it, we ask the robot, what would happen? Recognizing, that's better than asking nobody, but that should be flagged very clearly in the report. This adjudication was made by an AI. It offered this justification, and in some sense, we should, discount this piece. I mean, this is part of the idea of representing. One of the models I have in my head about netting out data is that very often war games, I think I have a slide for this somewhere in these appendices, is that they're often kind of presented as take it or leave it. We ran the game, we did it 26 times, 8 times this happened, 7 times that happened, 5 times this happened. This is what happened in the times when it worked. take it or leave it. Like, there's a lot of stuff going on in a game, you know? And I'd much rather be in a place where you could see distinct moments or outputs inside the game. This was adjudicated this way, that was adjudicated this way, this decision worked like this, SME said this is highly unlikely, but we let it happen anyway. And you could almost see like a chart of all of these things and then kind of look at it and go, well, these bits of the game are not very good. But this bit here, this little moment here of a bunch of decisions, all of this from this initial condition, which the initial condition, how it got to it was, we're not sure. But after that, all of this works. The SME said, yeah, that would happen, this would happen. And you could net out that bit of data. Because one of the problems with an all or nothing approach is it's not really the way other methods work. But statistics never says, here's my model, I explained everything I know. In fact, they very consciously say, this model explains a certain amount of the variance, right? And you know, if you're scoring like a 0.4, i.e. you counted for 40% of the variance that explains the outcome, that's considered a win. So, you know, statisticians are very happy to say, hey, it's very noisy. Here's some of the stuff we could get out. Furthermore, most of these variables didn't do anything. Like, they're all just bust. But here's 3 that seem to have significance. The wargaming equivalent of that would be, here's a big load of stuff that happened in a game. This bit, this bit, this bit, and this bit are worth your attention. The rest of it, maybe not so much. I think that, to me, would be a far more persuasive wargame report, in which I could sort of say, okay, I don't have to buy all of it. I can buy bits of it. And so to your point, that's a place where the AI could help move the game along, but that you might also say, hey, warning, this bit of the game, the AI was in the driver's seat, not anyone who can actually justify or explain what they're doing in a way that we find truly recognizable, and so discount.
Thanks for the talk today. I've just got a quick question jumping off the points of hobby wargamers. I'm wondering if there's anything which we can learn from people who enjoy complex rule systems yet play games for, say, escapism, which may be different from people who do professional wargaming or people who are being introduced to it who might have a preconceived narrative or are maybe put off by complex game systems yet are based in whimsical hobby games. For example, I'm thinking of Root off the top of my head.
So let me say, I think there is a place for this in some ways. I mean, there's a number of ways. The most obvious way is, as far as I can see it, and please correct me if I'm wrong, the professional wargaming discipline is about 10 years behind the commercial wargaming space in terms of design. The design innovation is mostly in the commercial sector, and then something is introduced there as a mechanism, like point-to-point or card-driven games or whatever it is, and then people in the professional world, many of whom are hobby wargamers, including me, go, oh, that's awesome. I'll totally put that into my next game, right? So that's one way there's a conduit, a very clear conduit, is that the innovative design, quad design grammar is, you know, it's in the market, right? That's, you know, the market decides, we love these cards, let's have more of them, and they get refined and improved. But I think on your other point here about the complexity of rules, let me say 2 things. One is, I'm a big believer that more complexity does not equal more fidelity. Right? It just means more complexity. You know, I've used this analogy before, but I'll use it again. A World War II game with a 5-page rule book and a World War II game with a 60-page rule book have more in common with each other than they have with World War II, right? Add 100 pages to the rule book. They still have more in common with each other than they have with World War II. World War II is highly complicated, and 50 pages of rules is not going to do it. So you're already cutting. So all games are about what they left out, not what they put in. So no amount of a big rule book makes that useful. But however, let me say the following. This is Peter Perla's observation, with which I instinctively agree. We still have to actually establish this, but I think he's right. All games have 2 tensions they have to resolve: representation, playability. Now, representation is the thing you want to model, and you might want to model something very complicated. However, the more complicated that gets, the less playable it becomes. And if it loses playability, that's not just a bummer for the players, it's screwing up your results. They're no longer playing like somebody who's able to play the game, they're playing as somebody who's frustrated, confused, doesn't understand their choices, angry, bored, whatever it is they're doing. Those are not what you're looking for. You're looking for somebody who's like, I'm thinking about my choices, I'm deciding not to invade from the coast because I'm deciding not to invade, not because I don't understand any of the invasion rules and I'm not getting into it. So there's a place here for professional wargame players, because I think that's where we can reconcile this. You want to have a highly complicated model, you need people who can, you're going to present them with a 40-page rule book and say, no problem, I'll read it over the weekend, let's get going on Monday. That would be a useful place for a kind of a part of a professional cadre of people whose job it is to play the games, because they're not intimidated by many moving parts. And so you're not stuck with oversimplifying. Because the other way of doing this, which is the way we did it, for example, for the NATO game last year, is you've got to kind of make mega games where everyone does a little bit, which is simple for them, and then somebody else is doing something that's kind of simple over there, and together that's creating an emergent game that's much more complicated, but that generates all sorts of problems and trade-offs of its own. So I do think there's a space here for kind of a literacy in game playing, or even a fluency in game playing, separate from being a game designer, separate from being a researcher, right? I mean, if we think about the professionalizing of wargaming, this could be something you have. I know somebody in the United States, John Compton, I mean, he writes about this publicly. This is what he does, right? He develops rigid games, and then he has the same players play it over and over again. He's trying to identify winning strategies. And the best way to identify the winning strategy is have people play the game and understand it. So first few games, like, I don't understand this game, I don't know what I'm doing. By game 10, they figured out the first wave of effective strategies, then they figured out the counters. You're getting something here from that experience and ability to play that I think is useful. So I do actually think there's a space here for the kind of 50-pager players, but it's not in that they have a better insight necessarily into why the game is good or bad. The reason I play a 50-page game of rulebook is because I think that's fun. That's the real reason. And my definition of fun is, I like it when it's got all these moving parts and complicated procedures. But I might say, that's more realistic. But it's more, I like all of that. I want to make all of these choices. I don't want to just have something simple. But anyway, hopefully my point there is clear.
All right, well, unfortunately, we're out of time, but we do have a group section planned in the admin room, which is just right through the door, so you can head straight over there. If you'd like to join us, ask us any more questions, or deliver any sort of comments, thoughts, or feedback. But first, we'll join you. Thank you, Dr. Banks, for the lecture.
Thank you.